Hey everyone! In this video, we're going to create a Tintype look using On1 Photo RAW 2020. So I'm inside On1 Photo RAW, and with this tutorial, we're going to be using a more vintage dated photograph, but you can always use modern images as well. The more vintage style, however, that's in the photograph, the better it's going to look with this Tintype look. So if you have an old vintage photograph like this one, the Tintype look is going to just appear amazing on this photograph. If you're using a more modern image, just make sure you turn on a black and white filter to desaturate it, or take your saturation down to about 80 or -75. You don't want a whole lot of color in these old-timey images. So to make it easy, we're going to start with this already desaturated vintage photograph. And the first thing we want to do is we want to kind of flatten the image a bit and add a little bit of fade. This image has a lot of contrast already. So we're going to head into our Effects tab here. We're going to add a filter. And the first filter we're going to add that works really well for this kind of Tintype look is this vintage filter. Vintage look. But I like to go into the vintage filter here, and I'm going to go into my More style. And I'm going to go to Earth and Sky. Now already adding that Earth and Sky style, if I turn this off and on, you can see it's already kind of flattening things out a bit and giving it even more of an old-timey feel. You can look into these kind of highlights in here. If I turn this off and on, it looks a lot more old-timed and old-fashioned that way. So now we have our vintage filter. Let's add another filter that adds a really nice kind of Tintype look, and that's the antique filter. Again, antique, vintage. So inside of the antique filter here, we're going to go into our More styles, and we're going to go to Neutral, and then we're going to head into our color here, and we're going to go down to Deli. So if I click on Deli here, and I turn off this antique filter, it does a whole lot to add on that almost warm, really kind of grainy, low contrast style that we're looking for in this Tintype look. So now that we've added on that antique filter, I want to warm this photo up a bit. The Tintype look usually has kind of a warm style to it. So we're going to add another filter. And another filter I really like that adds on a vintage style is the LUTs filter. And that's just because it adds on style really quickly. So with this LUTs filter, I typically go into my More menu and I go down to Honky Tonk. So as I click on that, you can see it adds on a bit of warmth to this image, which looks really nice for that kind of old-fashioned Tintype look we're going for. So what I want to do with this LUTs filter is I actually want to remove the brightness that it's incorporating into the image. So if I turn this off and on, it's actually brightening things up a bit. And I actually only want the color from this LUTs filter. So I'm going to go into my blend modes here, and then I'm going to go down to my mode, and instead of having normal, I'm going to go down to color. If I choose color here, that's going to protect the tonalities in my photograph and strictly apply this LUTs filter to the colors in my photo. So if I turn this off and on now, I only have the color on my photograph. So now we have these three filters here, and this is kind of our base for the Tintype look. Now, going back to this old dated photo here, if you were to use a modern image, just remember that you need to lower the saturation. Just remember that you need low saturation and not a whole lot of color in your photo. So now that we have our base here, let's add another filter, and now we need to bring on the textures that go along with that Tintype look. So I'm going to add a texture here, and we're going to go into our preset styles, and we're going to choose this Grunge Vignette Dark. Now I like what this is doing under the photograph, but it's a little bit too intense. So we're going to actually head back into that gear icon for this texture. We're going to go into these three sliders here, and we're going to use these three sliders to protect certain tones in our photograph from this textures filter. So I'm actually going to pull up on my shadows slider here, and that's going to protect the shadow tones from this textures filter. And then I'm going to pull up on the skin slider, and that's going to protect the skin tones or the mid tones in this photograph. So now if I turn this textures filter off and on, it's just adding in a little bit more texture and a little bit more use to the photograph, so it looks a little bit more old-fashioned that way. We have a little bit of a light leak over here to the right, and then kind of some textures over here to the left, but nothing too crazy, so we can really get wild with the textures we're adding. And we'll do that in a minute with a few more textures, but I'm just going to turn this textures filter back on. And now we can add another filter. And for this step, you actually have to import a filter. So in the description of this video, there's a link to download that texture. Once you've downloaded that texture, just go to your textures, and then we're going to import. So now let's go and we'll find that texture, we'll import it. So now that you have that wet plate 10 texture added into your textures filter, go up to the opacity and increase that to 100. That's going to enable this entire texture to appear on your image. Now we're going to modify the mode of that texture. We're going to go to our mode and we're going to click replace. That's simply going to replace our image with this texture. The cool thing about this is we can still use our blend modes for this filter to blend this texture on. So I'm going to click on the blending options here, and I'm going to go to my mode, and I'm going to go down to hard light. So if I click on hard light here, you can see it really adds on that nice tintype look, but it's a little bit too intense. So we're going to use a similar technique we did earlier by protecting our shadows and our highlights and our midtones. So we'll just go into these sliders here, and I'm going to pull up on my shadows a little bit. I'll pull up on my skin just a hair, like that. And then maybe the highlights just a hair as well. Perfect. And we can always fix this a little bit with a curves filter in a minute, but this looks really good for right now to really add on that old-fashioned tintype look for our shot. So now let's add a filter. We'll add a curves filter, and we're going to use the curves filter here to simply kind of boost our midtones up a bit. So I'm going to drop a point in my shadows here. That's going to make sure that my shadows stay there. They don't get moved when I modify this tone curve. Then I'm going to drop another point kind of up near my highlights here, in between my midtones and my whites. And then I'm going to drop a point in my midtones, and I'm just going to pull this up like that. And you can kind of play with this second point right here to adjust. Probably leave it like that. But you can see by pulling up on those midtones, it really gives it that old-fashioned feel, gives it that kind of blown-out look that we are going for with that tintype style of photography. Now we can always go back into this texture here, and it looks like it's kind of covering up this area to the right and to the left. So let's just go and we'll pull up on our skin just a little bit more, maybe about right there. And this is kind of dependent on which photo you're editing. If you don't have a bunch of subjects in here, you could simply just leave it as is, and it kind of creates a vignette around our subjects here. But now let's add another filter. I'm going to select the curves filter so that I add a filter on top, and then I'm going to add a filter, and we'll add the borders filter. Now the borders filter is an awesome filter for adding in a little bit of texture to the sides and the top of your image. So let's go into our emulsion presets here, and I'm going to go to my borders, and let's just choose a nice emulsion border. That seems to work best for that tintype style of photography. And let's just use emulsion 1. That looks good just like that. So now with this borders filter, it's white right here, which I don't really want. I almost want this black to look like it's the edge of the photograph. So I'm going to go down to this invert button, and I'm going to click invert. Now by inverting this, it's just going to invert the colors here, so now we see black instead of white. So if I turn off this border here, it does a really great job of just bringing on that nice border to the edge of our photograph, adding in a little more vintage style. And you could always go down into your transform area here, and you could modify your fit image. So if you want your image to be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller in the border, you can do that in here. I'll just leave it right there at about 2. That looks pretty good right there. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we've really achieved that nice tintype look using different textures, filters inside On One Photo RAW 2020.